Order. Order. I invite the Secretary of State to continue with the delivery of his statement. Order. Just before that, I will exceptionally take the point of order. These situations don't arise very often, and it's very much to be hoped that they won't arise frequently in the future. I say, for the benefit of the people observing our proceedings, that I call the Honourable Lady to raise a point of order in the knowledge that she's the member for Totnes and the chair of the Health Select Committee, but she serves also as the chair of the Liaison Committee, which embraces all of the chairs of all of the select committees of this House. Dr. Sarah Wollaston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given the exceptional importance of this document, and the fact is that members from both sides of the House have not had a chance to read it in advance, could I ask exceptionally, Mr. Speaker, that you suspend the sitting for longer to give members a chance to read it before the Secretary of State continues?
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for her point of order. I don't think it's right for me to suspend for a sustained period off my own bat and in the expectation, perhaps even the knowledge, that there would be very strongly differing views about such a suspension. Almost as the Honourable Lady raised her point of order, I heard members expressing enthusiasm for the idea and members expressing opposition. I don't think that would be the right thing to do now, in all honesty. There will be an opportunity for a general debate on our relationship with Europe post-Brexit on Wednesday. Members know that there are other opportunities to put urgent questions. I know that the Honourable Lady is concerned about the legislative business on Monday. My advice to her is that she should form the clearest possible impression of government policy and intent today before making such judgments as she and others have to make. The exchanges on this statement will be run fully, and I think I will leave it there for today. And I thank the Secretary of State for his forbearance. Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we leave the EU, free movement of people will come to an end. We will control the number of people who come to our country. We will assert stronger security checks at the border. The government will also seek a reciprocal mobility arrangement with the EU, in line with the approach we intend to take with other key trading partners around the world. In practice, having ended free movement, this is about enabling firms to move their top talent across border to deliver services, facilitating travel without a visa for tourism and business trips, and making sure that our students and youngsters in the UK and the EU continue to benefit from the educational opportunities in universities, colleges, and indeed the rich tapestry of cultural life right across the continent. Next, Mr. Speaker, the White Paper addresses Europe's security, which has and will remain the UK's security. That's why the government has made an unconditional commitment to maintain it. The government's proposal is for a new security partnership with the EU to tackle the shared, complex and evolving threats, enabling the UK and the EU to act together on some of the most pressing global challenges. It is important that the UK and the EU can continue operational cooperation on law enforcement and criminal justice to keep people safe right across Europe. Our proposals extend to other areas of cooperation of vital importance to the UK and the EU, including the continued protection and exchange of personal data, new arrangements on fishing, cooperative accords on science and innovation, culture and defence research. Mr. Speaker, when we leave the EU, the European Court will no longer have jurisdiction over this country. At the same time, we need to be able to interpret what we've agreed accurately and consistently, and manage any future bones of contention sensibly and responsibly. Our proposals provide for proper accountability and the consistent interpretation of UK-EU agreements by both parties. We envisage resolving disputes that may arise through arbitration, which is fair, balanced and reflective of global practice. And to provide the foundation for a new and enduring relationship, the agreement must be flexible enough to enable us to review and, if necessary, revise its operation over time in the best interests of this country, as is common in free trade agreements across the world. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I would like to make one thing very clear. We will not sign away our negotiating leverage or spend taxpayers' money in return for nothing. The financial settlement, which was agreed in December, substantially lower than EU demands, was agreed on the basis that it would sit alongside a deep and mutually beneficial future partnership. Mr. Speaker, we agreed we would meet our commitments as they fall due, with ever-declining payments over a finite period which add up to a fraction, a tiny fraction, of what would have been our net contribution. Both sides have been clear, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. Indeed, that is in keeping with the spirit of Article 50. There should be a firm commitment in the withdrawal agreement requiring the framework for the future relationship to be translated into legal text as soon as possible. And of course, if one party fails to honour its side of the overall bargain, there will be consequences for the whole deal. For our part today, the UK Government is demonstrating, in good faith, with goodwill, our ambition, our resolve to ensure we do build that deep and special partnership with the publication of this White Paper. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister first outlined the blueprint for a deep and special relationship with the EU at Lancaster House, expanded on it further in speeches in Florence, Munich and at Mansion House. Those speeches have shaped, they continue to shape, our negotiations with the EU. I'm confident that a deal is within reach, given the success of the Prime Minister and her negotiating team so far. And most issues under the withdrawal agreement have by now been resolved, with a deal in place to secure the rights of over 3 million EU citizens living in the UK and around 1 million UK citizens living in the EU. And we have agreed a time-limited implementation period which gives businesses, governments, citizens the certainty to plan their lives and invest for the future. We will shortly publish a white paper on the withdrawal agreement and implementation bill, setting out how we will give effect to the withdrawal agreement in domestic law and demonstrating to the EU that the UK is a dependable negotiating partner, one that will deliver on its commitments. So, Mr. Speaker, our discussions with the EU will squarely focus on our shared future. This white paper sets out how we can achieve that new partnership. Now, it is time for the EU to respond in kind. We approach these negotiations with a spirit of pragmatism, compromise and indeed friendship. I hope, I trust, that the EU will engage with our proposals in the same spirit, and I plan to meet Michel Barnier next week to discuss the detail in person. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, the Government is preparing in the event that that spirit of pragmatism and goodwill is not reciprocated. And on Monday I spoke with my right honourable friend the Prime Minister and we agreed to step up our planning for the no-deal scenario so that the UK is ready for Brexit no matter what the outcome of these negotiations. It is the responsible thing for a government to do. Mr. Speaker, this white paper sets out the right Brexit deal, delivering on the result of the referendum, taking back control over our money, laws and borders, supporting the economy by maintaining a strong trading relationship after we've left, ending free movement whilst avoiding a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, or indeed between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, restoring sovereignty over Parliament and the authority of the UK Supreme Court, seizing the opportunity to forge new trade deals around the world and maintaining cooperation with the EU in the many other areas that we prize, including security cooperation to keep our people safe. This is our vision for a bold, ambitious and innovative new partnership with the EU. Principled and practical, faithful to the referendum, it delivers a deal that is good for the UK and good for our EU friends, and I commend this statement and the white paper to the House.
Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the new Secretary of State to his place? I'm sure he doesn't need me to tell him the size of the task he faces. Not just negotiating with the Conservative Party, but eventually with the EU as well. So whatever our differences, and there are many, I genuinely wish him well. Can I gently say this? He's not got off to a very good start. The utter shambles of the last 20 minutes that led to the suspension of the House during a statement is clear evidence, Mr. Speaker, of why the government is in such a mess. From their sedentary positions, the front bench comment. Normally, I would say thanks in advance for the white paper. But on this occasion, my first question for the Secretary of State is why the government thought it appropriate to share the white paper in full with journalists at 9 a.m. this morning. I think they were given 15 minutes to read it before questions could be asked, unlike the 5 that we adjourned for, and give them hard copies, and only to provide the opposition with a copy 3 hours later. As he will know, my office has been onto his office all morning asking for this white paper. It was delivered at 11:55 a.m. and we saw the shambles that followed. So why was it, in this occasion, on this issue, appropriate to give it to the press at 9 a.m. and to the opposition 3 hours later? Mr. Speaker, that's not the only breach of protocol. I was handed the Secretary of State's statement as we finished business questions. But for the point of order, that would have been as he stood up. I think that's in breach of the Ministerial Code, which suggests 45 minutes. It is deeply discourteous. It's unacceptable. I have to say, having heard the statement, I didn't miss much. But the serious point is this, Mr. Speaker. The point of these statements, the point is to allow questions to be asked of the Secretary of State, and by proceeding in this way, this utter shambles, it denies proper scrutiny of this white paper. And I'm sure the House would like to know when the Secretary of State... I'm sure that... I'm sure that... Well, the Secretary of State, in his sedentary position for the environment, I think went out on Sunday morning on one of the television shows and said the great thing about the Chequers compromise is that it has united the cabinet. That was just hours before the Brexit Secretary started penning his letter, and then the Foreign Secretary. So I think I won't be taking too much advice from him. As for the new Secretary of State, I'm sure the House would like to know when he was first shown the contents of the white paper. He wasn't at Chequers. So when did Ollie Robbins tell him that this was the policy he now had to sell? It's an important question, because 2 white papers, it appears, are being published today. The one now before the House, and the alternative one apparently drafted by his own department. That's now available, Mr. Speaker, in instalments on Conservative Home. In fact, it beat this white paper to publication. I listened very carefully to what the Secretary of State said earlier on the Today programme, and today when he described this white paper as innovative. Just for the record, can the Secretary of State confirm to the House this morning that he does actually agree with everything in the white paper that he's presenting? And turning to the substance, obviously we will have to look at the detail. But the purpose of the short Chequers statement issued on Friday was to hold the Cabinet together. It clearly failed in that objective, unravelling within 48 hours. If this white paper is more of the same, it will undoubtedly share the same fate. Mr. Speaker, across business communities, among trade unions, and I genuinely believe across this House, there is growing unity that the UK should remain economically close to the EU. And that means negotiating a comprehensive customs union with the EU 27 and a single market deal with the right balance of rights and obligations tailored to the UK. That combination is also the only way of delivering on the solemn promise of no hard border in Northern Ireland. The white paper falls long short of that. So I'd like to ask the Secretary of State for a simple answer to a simple question. Is this white paper the government's starting position in the next phase of the negotiations, in which case we can expect further evolution of the government's position? Or is it the government's final position, as far as they're prepared to go, new red lines? Let me develop on that theme. The White Paper sets out proposals for a facilitated customs arrangement. Mr. Speaker.
Order. I'll just... Conversations regularly take place between members of respective benches. I'm not complaining about that. I simply thought it right that the conversation should be concluded and the interrogation could then continue, because that would seem to be a courteous way in which to proceed. Sir Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I didn't say anything because I assumed the Secretary of State was being briefed on the contents of the White Paper. As for the facilitated customs arrangement, we think the proposals would be a bureaucratic nightmare and unworkable, costly for business. It relies on technology that doesn't currently exist. If, on analysis, the EU27 agree with that assessment and reject the proposal on a customs arrangement, is the government's position that we should then negotiate a customs union with the EU, as the majority in this House think we should? And on services, almost nothing. So again, if the government's proposal for mutual recognition and enhanced equivalence fail, what then? Mr. Speaker, in the short time I've had available, a number of features of this White Paper do leap out. Visa-free travel to work. Now, in his statement, the Secretary of State said that this was for business trips. In the White Paper, it says for business activity, and I wonder if he could clear up the difference between the two. That's Chapter 1, Paragraph 76. Chapter 1, Paragraph 89. Reciprocal arrangements on social security. Could he elaborate for the House on what that is? Chapter 4, Paragraph 4. That this will take the form of an association agreement. Again, if the Secretary of State could elaborate on that. And on page 93, paragraph 42, the reference to the role of the European Court and references on interpretation. Perhaps he could elaborate to the House on that. But, Mr. Speaker, coming 15 months after Article 50 was triggered and just 3 months before the Article 50 agreement is expected, this White Paper has obviously arrived very late in the day. The Chequers statement unravelled in 2 days. When the details of this White Paper are examined, there's very few reasons to believe it will not suffer the same fate. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The Secretary of State, Secretary Dominic Raab.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I just apologise for the late arrival? We will look into what happened with the clerks, and I would like to apologise to the honourable gentleman, and we will avoid it happening again. Can I also thank him for his generous welcome? I noticed it came in 2 parts, but I'm genuinely looking forward to working with him at this historic crossroads for our country. Like him, I'm a recovering lawyer. Like him, I voted to trigger Article 50. And we both stood on manifestos at the last general election which promised the British people we would leave the EU. I hope he will forgive me every now and again if I remind him of that. The honourable gentleman made some rather disobliging comments on unity. May I just ever so gently say to him that people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones? There have been, at last count, 103 front-bench resignations from Labour under their current leader, a record unlikely to be rivalled any time in the foreseeable future. He made a number of procedural and process points which seemed rather displacement activity for anything Labour has to say on the substance of Brexit.
But, Order, I do intend to call everybody to question the Secretary of State. It is only fair that questions are heard with courtesy and that the replies are heard with courtesy. Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful. He asked some specific points. He asked if I agree with the White Paper. Yes, of course. He asked if the White Paper was a starting point for the negotiation or the end point. This is a negotiation, but we're confident it is a principled, practical approach that can deliver a lasting deal, a good deal for this country and for the EU. He made some comments about services. In fact, What we're looking to do is make sure that we have full autonomy over the rulemaking in relation to services, which will be with arrangements for recognition so that we retain our service provision between the UK and the EU, but freed up to trade in services more energetically and more liberally with the trade deals we do right across the world. On free movement, the White Paper is clear if he wants to read it in good faith and understand our position. We've made clear we're ending free movement. That means we're going to take back control of our borders. It means that we will have stronger security checks at the border. It also means we'll have control over the number of people that come to this country. At the same time, we want Britain to be an open, outward-looking country. We want to encourage and facilitate business trips from the EU to the UK. That's common sense. We want to make sure there's visa waiver travel for tourism, for holidays for families. That's common sense. And of course, for students and those young people wanting to engage in research or go to universities or indeed engage in the cultural activities across the continent, we would obviously want to have sensible arrangements on that. That is common sense too. Mr. Speaker, he talked about the customs union and the single market. He needs to be clear. If Labour's position is to remain in the single market or the customs union, if, as he said before, freedom of movement is up for negotiation, his words, not mine, it breaks every promise every Labour candidate made at the last election, which was to end free movement. This government, Mr. Speaker, now stands ready to work with the EU over the coming weeks ahead of the European Council in October. We must move at pace. We must negotiate with resolve to deliver the prosperous and secure future that all our peoples deserve.
Mr. Iain Duncan-Smith.
Mr. Speaker, may I welcome, first of all, my right honourable friend to the Cabinet. I've believed for a long time that it was a place that he should have been in before. Can welcome him, however, I also recognise that this is a very complex issue. My own personal views on this will be no secret to him. I have deep misgivings about what the government is proposing, but I would like, having voted to leave, I voted to leave, not to half leave. But I do want to say to my right honourable friend, paragraph 7D, to pursue what the right honourable gentleman said on the opposition, we have seen very little about the migration proposals, and these seem to be out there as part of what might be referred to as negotiating capital. So to follow this question, which is quite legitimate, I think, in paragraph 7D, the phrase here at the end of it is arrangements that the UK might want to offer to other close trading partners in the future. My simple question is, when the government goes to discuss, negotiate or confer with the EU, whichever phrase suits, does he believe that they would be prepared to withdraw the rights to benefits for those who come without jobs?
Well, I thank my right honourable friend. Let me give him some assurance. Free movement will end. It is not up for negotiation. Equally, as countries right around the world do when they engage in free trade negotiations, the issue of visas is often considered alongside it, and that's the approach that we will take.
Deidre Brock.
Mr. Speaker, and of course I too must wish the Cabinet Secretary the very best of British luck with his new role. BrExit, of course, was a disastrous outcome of Tory infighting, and it now looks like the Tory compromise from last week is also falling victim to Tory infighting, an embarrassment and massively damaging. In January last year, the Prime Minister laid out 12 principles to underpin her Brexit process. The first was certainty and clarity. We have had neither. The take-home from this latest Brexit White Paper seems to be that we are leaving the EU, but we're putting in place regulations to comply with EU regulations on the movement of goods, so we'll have no say in the decisions, but will abide by them. So what is the mechanism that will check the UK's regulatory compliance with EU rules to allow access to the market? Will the UK use EU standards in negotiations on other trade agreements, or will there be a whole set of different standards for each agreement? Even more importantly, though, is that services make up 80% of the UK's economy, and paragraph 48 of the White Paper says the UK and the EU will not have current levels of access to each other's markets. That is the government limiting the sector's access to the world's biggest market. That is massively damaging. What measures will the government bring in to compensate for that bizarre and unhelpful move? And Scotland is right in the firing line with this Brexit dither and indecision, damaged yet again by Tory infighting and intransigence. Isn't it time the government accepted that this is a wrong-headed scheme and kept us in the single market and customs union? It would be well advised to take the measured and sensible approach recommended by the Scottish Government ahead of last week's JMC. Will that be considered? Now, the government's own analysis showed that Brexit is massively damaging, no matter what protections are offered. Will the government now listen to wiser heads and reverse course for everyone's good and stay in the single market and customs union? And lastly, Mr. Speaker, what on earth is happening in this place? Not only did opposition parties get copies of the white paper appallingly late, it is customary for party spokespeople to receive cited statements before ministers rise to their feet, not during, as happened here. This government's contemptuous treatment of this Parliament is once again laid bare for all to see.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, the decision to leave the EU was not a decision by any political party. It was a decision by the UK in a referendum, free and fair, and which every party in this House, when the legislation providing for it was passed, agreed to respect the outcome. In relation to trade in goods and services, we will be taking the decision to agree to a common rule book because we want to mitigate any risk of friction at the border, but this House and the government, the UK, will have the chance to feed in to any potential changes that may occur over time through consultation, and ultimately there's a parliamentary lock to make sure elected members in this House have the last word. And the reality is, in relation to goods, is that the caucus, the body of law around it, remains relatively stable. Unlike goods, services are not affected by frictions at the border. They're not subject to tariffs or customs, and unlike the vast majority of manufactured goods and agri-food products, most services are not subject to specific standards. She complained about rule taking in relation to goods, then she complained about us not being subject to services. It made no sense at all.
Sir William Cash.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am deeply worried indeed about the proposals that I've read already in this white paper and in the three-page document that we received the other day, and for this reason. On the issue of sovereignty of Parliament, we passed the Withdrawal Act, which repeals the 1972 Act. Under these proposals, as I read them, and the so-called parliamentary lock, in compliance with a common rule book, which would deal with regulatory rule-taking from the EU and discussions that would take place around that, page 91 of this document tells us that it will be scrutinised in accordance with the normal legislative procedure and that Parliament could decide not to enact them. Now, I understand what they're getting at, but, if I may say, Mr. Speaker, as Chairman of the European Scrutiny Committee, and having been on that committee for 33 years, despite what was promised in the White Paper in 1971, before the 72 Act, I can assure the House that never, in my experience, has there ever been an occasion when the House has overturned a European regulation, which puts me on serious caution. Therefore, I have to ask, how would this system work in practice? Would it be wit-ridden, and would it be burglar-proof from the so-called parliamentary lock?
Well, I thank my honourable friend, and I pay tribute to his huge experience in this area. In relation to the parliamentary scrutiny and the ability for the UK to control any changes in the common rule book for goods, let's be clear, as I said before, we would expect to have a proper dialogue in relation to any changes that were made on both sides, and there would be a parliamentary lock to make sure that in translating them into legislation in this country, that there was proper democratic oversight. Of course, if this House and this Parliament decided not to, it would have consequences for the agreement, and that would feed back into the review mechanisms and the dispute resolution mechanism that we've carefully tailored. That's the balanced approach we sought to make sure that we have consistent interpretation of the rules that we're going to apply in that area, whilst retaining democratic oversight in this House.
Mr. Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I say to you, Mr. Speaker, that I hope that a new principle has been established today, that in future members of this House will get copies of white papers at the same time as members of the Fourth Estate. And can I say to the Secretary of State, in welcoming him genuinely to his post, which has many challenges, can I suggest that he organises a briefing for members of the House with officials on the white paper in line with the very helpful briefing that was held on Monday on the Chequers agreement. Now, Mr. Speaker, given that the government, in the statement on the Chequers agreement, said that it would commit by treaty to ongoing harmonisation with EU rules on goods, can he tell the House today whether the facilitated customs arrangement, if it is agreed by the EU, would be ready to be implemented by the 31st of December 2020? And if not, what arrangements does the government propose to put in place to cover the gap there would then be between that date and the date on which the new arrangements would finally and fully come into effect?
Before the Secretary of State replies, can I just say, for the avoidance of doubt, that I entirely accept what the Right Honourable Gentleman, the Member for Leeds Central, has just said. And for the avoidance of doubt and for future good practice, it must be accepted that documents about which statements are to be made should not first be released, even if in protected conditions, I think, other than in the most exceptional circumstances, to the media before being released to members of the House. I know the Secretary of State is himself a very, very assiduous parliamentarian and a person of great courtesy, so it seems to me obvious that he will readily accept this. But I think that when the point is made with such force by the chair of a select committee, and a similar point has been made by the chair of the liaison committee, I think I'm right in saying the point brooks of no contradiction. The Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I certainly accept the point he made, and I also accept the suggestions that I will take away and consider and look at very carefully that my right honourable friend, the right honourable gentleman made. He also asked, I think, most specifically about the implementation and whether we would be ready. Of course, to some degree, it depends on the precise contours of the deal that we strike with the EU, but we are making sure we're striving every sinew to make sure that we've got all the preparations, legislative and administrative, in place to make sure we can deliver any deal that we strike with the EU.
Steve Baker.
Mr. Speaker, without wishing to be at all indiscreet, page 95, paragraph 54, puts me in relation to legislation, puts me in mind of discussions about the negotiability of my preferred way of implementing the withdrawal agreement and implementation bill in relation to the implementation period. For what reason does he think he can negotiate with the EU a mechanism which does not accept the principles in the European Communities Act? That is, the EU law where we accept the acquis comes directly into our law without this Parliament having a veto.
Right. Can I just say to my honourable friend, pay tribute again to him for all the work he did both as a minister and as a tireless parliamentarian in this House. I think the reality is there is no off-the-shelf model that will work for the bespoke relationship we need with the EU, given the imperatives of giving effect to the referendum, to take back control over our border, our laws and our money, at the same time as forging a relationship, given our long-standing and deep relationship we've had as an EU member, and our desire, and I think it's replicated on both sides, to make sure we continue cooperation in those areas that both sides prize.
Sorry. Who are we on now? Let me see. Tom Brake.
First of all, can I welcome him to his position? He's had his first taste of the Brexit shambles that are being inflicted on this country. I welcome his support for the principle that people can change their mind. In 2016, he'll remember that he said that Tory MPs may push for a second referendum after 2020 if Remain wins. So I assume he'll be back in calls for a final say on the deal. But my question is, can the Secretary of State point to the section in the White Paper which sets out the cost to British businesses and households and jobs of this Brexit folly? They're entitled to know the true cost of his Brexit obsession.
Well, thank the honourable gentleman. The entire approach of this White Paper is to make sure we have frictionless trade between the UK and the EU to minimise the risk he's concerned about. In relation to referendums and second referendums, I just point out, if you actually read the whole article, not the selective snippet, I made the point that under the EU Act that this House passed, there would always be ongoing and further opportunities for referendum. What I didn't do, which the honourable gentleman did, is stand up and make the argument in relation to the legislation that we had when we passed the Referendum Act, that we would all respect the outcome and then renege on it. And that's bad faith to the electorate.
John Barron.
My right honourable friend to his post. I know he'll be well aware of the deep concern on both sides about the extent to which the UK becomes a rule taker under the so-called Common Rule Book. Has he had time to make an early assessment as to the percentage of our goods that will be subject to this common rule book? And by way of illustration, can he answer a question I've been asking but so far haven't had the answer to? And that is, will we, under this common rule book, be able to ban the export of live animals to the EU, something that we want to do as a country but are unable to do whilst we're members of the EU?
Thank you. Well, I thank the honourable gentleman. I do understand his concerns. I've already addressed in my earlier questions some of the points about the way in practice this House will retain scrutiny, and I would just say to him that under the facilitated customs arrangement, up to 96% of UK goods trade is likely to pay the correct or no tariff at the border. So that gives him, I hope, a sense of the minimisation of disruption that we'll achieve.
Chris Bryant.
The problem still remains that there's not a majority for this in the House of Commons. And to be honest, the sooner we have a vote on that, the better, because it would just save the government a great deal of time. And I mean, I welcome the honourable member to his post because I found him to be a very good minister to do business with. But I just say to him, I hope today has shown that the more the government tries to use the powers of the executive to skirt round the side of Parliament, the less likely they are to achieve an agreement in this House that can eventually be sold to the European Union. I urge him to work with all members of this House to try and get a better deal, because otherwise we'll be falling out of the European Union without a deal, and that will harm our security.
I thank the honourable gentleman. I respect his view, even though we differ on this, as many other things that we agree on. I certainly take up his offer of working with him in the future as both the negotiations unfold but also the legislation. I would just gently say to him that on the Labour side and on the Conservative side, we all stood at the last election on manifestos committed to leaving the EU. You cannot leave the EU and stay in the single market and the customs union. No amount of haggling over procedural or process points can mask the divisions on their side or the failure to take a decision about what their actual position on Brexit should be.
Dr. Sarah Wollaston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for your comments. I welcome the Secretary of State to his post. But I would say to him, I don't think it's possible for members to question him about the White Paper without having had a chance to read it. So I would, however, want to ask him further about his statement where he says that he's going to step up planning for a no-deal scenario. Will he also commit to publishing the consequences of no deal so that individuals, communities and the economy, we can all assess what its impact will be?
Secretary of State.
Well, I thank the honourable lady, and I certainly respect her view, and I know she takes a very close interest in these matters. I seem to remember under previous administrations that statements and hard copy documents were received very late, but I've apologised for that, and I will endeavour and make sure that it isn't repeated. I would just say to her, in relation to her broader point, that we have got some tough choices to make, and what you see in the White Paper is reconciling the challenge of making sure we leave the customs union for all the benefits and the opportunities that are there to be grasped, whilst making sure we minimise any potential disruption to trade. And I will certainly be saying more and release more to the House on what our no-deal planning is in due course.
Yvette Cooper.
There's only 20 paragraphs in this white paper on immigration. They're very narrow. It just talks about business transfers, temporary business services, tourists and students. There's no reference to what would happen, for example, if the NHS wants to recruit long-term from the EU, perhaps for nurses or care workers. Is that because they're ruling out any provisions to support that for long-term recruitment, or is that because they haven't worked out how it would happen yet? And does he agree that it's really important, as we discuss immigration reform, that none of us revert to the kind of divisive language that we had on immigration during the referendum campaign?
Well, I think I thank the Right Honourable Lady for her points. I think actually the White Paper sets out very clearly we're ending free movement, but we want to take a sensible approach to things like business trips, to things like travel for holidays and for research and students coming both to the UK, to the EU and vice versa. Of course, we will look at this issue further as we bring forward our legislation from, my Right Honourable friend, the Home Secretary, brings forward that legislation. And as we've said, in relation to free trade agreements that we will be forging with countries around the world, the issue of visas will be subject to those negotiations just as they are with the EU.
Sir Roger Gale. My Right Honourable friend's commitment to animal welfare is very well known. Could he reassure the House that there is nothing in the Common Rulebook proposals that would frustrate the ambitions of my Right Honourable friend, Secretary of State for DEFRA, to improve and enhance animal welfare post-Brexit?
We've checked very carefully to make sure that that wouldn't be the case, and we will keep that in mind as we proceed both with the legislation and the negotiations.
Ben Bradshaw.
Mr. Speaker, there's only half a page in this document on health, and it's all on infectious diseases. That's in spite of our recent Health Committee report, which said quite clearly that lives and patient safety would be in danger if there's any interruption at all to the supply of vital medicines and medical equipment into this country. So how is he going to guarantee that and avoid that kind of scenario where patients' lives and safety are put at risk?
Secretary of State.
Well, the NHS is already making sure that we've got all the plans in place to provide the drugs and the staff, whether it's doctors, nurses, that we need. And of course, in relation to our approach to visas and immigration more broadly, we can make sure, because we're taking back control over our immigration policy, that we've got the right checks in place, whatever they're for, including for nurses, including for doctors, and making sure on medicines and other goods that we have the right approach for the country.
Sir Peter Bottomley.
The House will refer with interest the suggestion that both the House and the Government should consider whether papers can be released to MPs at the same time as the press, because the Select Committee reports, I think, have the same kind of procedures the Government's had up to now. Can I say that people should be aware that our Right Honourable friend, to whom I welcome to his post, received the Sergei Magnitsky Award in November last year for political campaigning on a cross-party basis, and we hope that his progress on this exiting the EU will have the same kind of cross-party support, because most voters and most MPs want to see the progress. A specific question, which comes at the end of the White Paper: as the European Union can't make an agreement with us until we've left, what will the procedures be to make sure that the agreements we make with them after implementation will be carried through?
Well, I thank my honourable friend. We've made it very clear there's no deal until we've got the whole deal done, and that means that in relation to the sequential nature of these negotiations, that there is going to be a link between the two. If we found, having agreed the withdrawal agreement, that the progress towards the future trade and special partnership arrangement was not proceeding apace, then it would have consequences for the rights and the obligations that the UK has undertaken, including in respect to the financial obligations that we undertake.
Kate Hoey.
In welcoming the Secretary of State to his position, can I add my voice to the fact that it's nonsense that we got this so late? Could I just ask him to confirm that Angela Merkel didn't have a copy before we had a copy in Parliament? And could I just ask him to state very categorically, Mr. Speaker, that after we leave the European Union, no person living in the Commonwealth countries will be treated any differently than anyone living in the former EU that we were part of, in terms of their relationship to this country in way of being able to come or not come. Equal rights for everyone living in the world, rather than giving any special rights to those living in the EU.
Well, thank the honourable lady, and I pay tribute to her long-standing interest in this and pugnacious campaigning during the referendum. Of course, we're ending free movement, and that allows us to avoid what is effectively a discriminatory approach between those coming from the EU and those coming from outside of the EU. The Home Secretary will be bringing forward legislation which will deal with some of the details of that, and of course it will make up part of the negotiation process with our EU partners.
Owen Patterson.
Mr. Speaker, paragraph 7 of Chapter 1 states that the proposal is to maintain a common rulebook for goods, including agri-food. Lobbyists estimate there are currently 170,000 pages of the acquis communautaire. How many of those pages will have to be re-legislated back into UK law, and once they are there, will they ever be amendable?
Well, I hope I can give my right honourable friend some reassurance, because what we want to make sure is that the common rule book would ensure manufacturers can continue to produce one product for both markets, preventing dual production, but the common rule book will only apply to the extent that it's necessary to avoid friction at the border.
Stephen Doughty.
Mr. Speaker, in paragraph 6 of the conclusion, the White Paper sets out, if the House of Commons supports a resolution to approve the withdrawal agreement and framework, the Government will bring forward the withdrawal agreement and implementation bill to give it legal effect in the UK. It says nothing about what happens if the House of Commons does not approve the withdrawal agreement. What does the Secretary of State believe will happen in that circumstance? Because given his past views, many of us suspect that what he's going to do is drive us towards a no-deal situation.
Well, let me reassure him. As set out in my earlier remarks and indeed in this white paper, we are striving in good faith, with goodwill, with some innovation, with some principle, but also a practical approach to get the best deal for the UK, but one which also is likely to be acceptable and achievable with our EU partners and friends. We are preparing for every eventuality, but I can reassure him that my goal, as I've actually always said, the most important, the optimum outcome will be delivering a deal which is good for this country and good for the EU.
Mr. David Jones.
May I also congratulate my right honourable friend on his well-deserved appointment. I'm sure he'll understand that I haven't yet had the opportunity to read the white paper to the degree of detail I would have liked. But nevertheless, I see from page 11 that the role of the European Court of Justice is preserved through a joint reference procedure as the interpreter of EU rules. Can my right honourable friend say how that is compatible with the removal of the United Kingdom from the jurisdiction of the ECJ? And as a practical matter, what right of audience would British advocates have, given that the UK will no longer be a member of the European Union?
Well, I thank my honourable friend. In relation to the ECJ, there is provision for reference where it is necessary for the consistent interpretation of the law. That could only be done through the joint committee that you referred to, agreeing, so the UK would have a veto over that. It would have to be with UK agreement. And it could also be done by an arbitration panel, but again, and he will know this, an arbitration panel, and what makes arbitration, international arbitration, different from accepting ECJ jurisdiction is that we would have arbitrators on those panels, and so it would be done with their agreement as well. This is not the same as having jurisdiction over disputes. It is making sure, where it is in the UK interest, and it will be, that there's consistent application of the common rules that we want to work effectively.
Pete Wishart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It has to be said that I think the way the statement commenced simply sums up the whole chaotic, clueless Brexit as prosecuted by the shambles of a government. Now, this is a white paper that was supposed to deliver cabinet unity, but all, as we have seen, is all it's done is to demonstrate the divisions. Scotland didn't vote for any of this, so can he perhaps suggest a way where Scotland can be spared this madness?
Here, here.
78% remaining.
We voted for this referendum as one country, and we need to respect it as one country.
Sir Edward Leigh.
Paragraph 76 is ambiguous. It says that we will seek reciprocal mobility arrangements. It doesn't say when. So will the Secretary of State give an absolute assurance that any preferential treatment given to EU migrants will not be part of a withdrawal agreement, but will be entirely in the hands of this Parliament post-Brexit? This is a vital point, because the people voted for Brexit because they wanted to control migration, and they don't want to be sold down the river on this point as the negotiations proceed.
Well, I thank my honourable friend. I can give him the reassurance it would not be part of the withdrawal agreement process. It would be part of the future deep and special relationship. And in the same way that as we approach global free trade with partners from Latin America to Asia, when you're looking at liberalisation of trade in goods, for example, through reduction of tariffs or services, you can also ensure that you've got sensible arrangements on visas.
Mike Gapes.
Speaker, my speed reading skills are not perfect, but I only notice two references to the overseas territories, one on page 96 and one in the conclusions. What does this white paper mean for British overseas territories, particularly does it mean that they will be treated in exactly the same way as the UK during any transition period, particularly Gibraltar?
Yes, the overseas territories will retain the status they have, and of course we're consulting with them and indeed with the devolved administrations right the way through this process.
Mrs. Theresa Villiers.
The Chequers agreement indicated that Parliament will have the right to reject future EU rules, but how will they ever exercise that power when the White Paper commits to an upfront choice to commit by treaty to ongoing harmonisation of the relevant EU rules?
I thank my right honourable friend. It will be done through the parliamentary lock, which means that this House ultimately can decide what goes into UK law, consistent with the outcome of the referendum. Of course, if we decide to renege on the commitment or to divert from the common rule book, that will have consequences for the relationship that we strike with the EU. And that's why there's both review mechanisms and also other ways, mechanisms for resolving disputes as and when they arrive. There will be, in any international treaty that is going to provide a sustainable, enduring basis for the deep ties that we have with the EU on trade, on security, need to make sure that we've got sensible proposals and mechanisms for ironing out creases in the relationship as they arise.
Kate Green.
Return again to paragraph 76. The Secretary of State said a few moments ago that he expected that future mobility arrangements in relation to industry needs for labour would be made through the medium of individual trade agreements. But business is concerned already about labour shortages in sectors like care, hospitality, retail and agriculture. Does he really think that his answer offers the security of labour supply that business needs to know now it will have in the immediate future?
Yes, you can cater for the needs of businesses and for the UK economy without having an open-door approach to immigration.
Anyone? Andrew Bridgen.
Yeah. I welcome my right honourable friend to his position, and while I and many colleagues may have grave concerns about the contents of the White Paper, I hope we can all agree of the importance of his role in delivering on the Brexit we promise the British people. And to that end, it's very important that he has the right support and help going forward. So, has my right honourable friend had any explanation as to why his first choice of special advisor, namely Stuart Jackson, the former member for Peterborough, was vetoed by the Cabinet Office?
Well, I'd like to pay tribute to the great work that all the special advisers have done, including Stuart Jackson, and indeed all the officials who work tirelessly with ministers to get the best deal for this country. And I'll be naming my special advisers shortly, as you'd expect in the normal course of reshuffle or a change in ministerial posts.
Jonathan Edwards.
Mr Speaker, the intergovernmental agreement signed between the Welsh Government and the British Government was meant to result in equitable decision-making on Brexit policy. Doesn't the fact that the Welsh Government wasn't even consulted upon on the content of the White Paper indicate that that agreement isn't worth the paper it's written on, and the Labour Government of my country was extremely naive to trust the British Government?
The honourable gentleman, I'm afraid, and I respect him, is just wrong on this. Sections of the White Paper were shared for comment with the devolved administrations, and copies of the White Paper were sent in advance.
Vicky Ford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I spent the past couple of days on a business trip, or maybe it was an activity to do business, meeting former colleagues from across Europe and asking them what they thought about the potential proposals. And there's a complete understanding that if we want to keep an open border with Ireland, we must have common standards on goods. And if we want to keep the UK united, we need that to apply to all of the UK. So may I wish the right honourable gentleman the best of luck in his future job, because there are many across Europe who want to help deliver this partnership.
Well, I thank my honourable friend, and I agree that that has been the feedback that we've had. You can want to end free movement without saying we're going to pull up the drawbridge. We need to have a balanced approach to immigration which protects and services the skills gap in this country, but also makes sure we deal with the pressures and the costs of immigration, and deals and make sure that we restore public confidence in the immigration system.
Andrew Slaughter.
The proposals on freedom of movement in the White Paper will please
No one. There's no certainty here for resident EU citizens or for those seeking to come here after 2020. But the list of exceptions is so wide and so unclear that it's already been rejected by the hard Brexiteers. The message seems to be you can stay or come here, but you are not welcome. And that, to my mind, is both incompetent as well as unpleasant. I have to say I had the Secretary of State down as neither of those things before today, so I wonder why he wants to be associated with this document.
Because it takes a balanced approach to immigration rather than pretending we can continue with the legacy of the previous government, which had an open-door approach to immigration, which destroyed public trust in the system. We need to take advantage of the economic benefits and control the pressures. That's a sensible approach.
Rachel MacLean.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The thing I hear most often from my constituents in Redditch, however they voted, is just get on with it. So can my right honourable friend confirm from the dispatch box there's nothing in this white paper that will lead to a second referendum which will only delay or frustrate the democratic will of my constituents and the British people?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. We need to crack on with these negotiations. I'll be going to Brussels next week, and the idea of a second referendum, as indeed I think the leader of the Liberal Democrats himself acknowledged before he ascended to his elevated position, would not only be unprincipled but would be totally counterproductive to public trust in practice.
Dr. Roberta Blackman-Woods.
Mr. Speaker, people across the country who work in our universities will want to know that any Brexit deal continues to give them access to European research funding and networks. These networks are really important for business development, for medicine and innovation across the piece. And while the White Paper says the UK wishes to explore association in research and innovation programmes, that begs the question of what the government has been doing for the last 2 years. And don't people who work in higher education deserve more certainty than a wish list?
Well, I just gently say to the honourable lady that the insistence on trying to sequence the negotiations was on the EU behalf. We have been consistently saying that actually we need to get on to the wider post-withdrawal relationship as soon as possible, but we are keen to do that, and I hope that the White Paper gives her a sense that this is going to be a priority for the government.
Sir Desmond Dwayne.
How can he justify the use of the adjective common in describing the noun rulebook when he's committed to ongoing harmonisation, even with a parliamentary process? It is their rulebook, isn't it?
Well, I understand the concerns that he and others will make about this. There will be, we are signing up to, or we are proposing to sign up to a common rule book. There will be an opportunity to influence it through consultation. There will be a parliamentary lock. And as I said before, there will be also the opportunity, if this is not in the UK interest, opportunity to revise the arrangements. But the reality is that the common rule book on manufactured goods, which would be at risk of creating friction at the border, has remained relatively stable over recent years. So I don't think in practice it would lead to the fears that he's outlined, understandably.
Wes Streeting.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The leader of the ERG, the Honourable Member for North East Somerset, has described this white paper as the greatest vassalage since King John paid homage to Philip II at Le Goulet in 1200. This white paper has not needed age to turn yellow. Presumably he can give us an eyewitness account. But it's clear from the resignations we've already seen from the government, the concerns we have on this side of the House, that this white paper, the government's negotiating position, doesn't command, at this stage, the support of a majority of the House of Commons. How does he possibly expect the united front of the EU 27 governments, the European Commission and the European Parliament to take this government at all seriously? Because this House, it is clear, does not.
Well, it's all sorts of quotes from my honourable friend. He's sort of blithely skated over the divisions in his own party. But the reality is, these are complex issues on which views diverge, and people feel very passionately about them. What we've set out is a positive principle, but also a flexible approach that is deliverable. And we're going to go and negotiate with the EU and make sure we get the best deal for the country. Simply sitting on the sidelines and carping and hoping that somehow the Brexit decision will be reversed, I'm afraid, is a fool's errand.
Mr. Marcus Jones.
I welcome a right honourable friend to his place. There were a number of reasons why my constituents voted to leave the EU. Amongst them was the principle of freedom of movement. Can he categorically assure my constituents that under his plans and the government's plans, freedom of movement will end, and this Parliament will consequently be in a position where it decides who we welcome to our great country?
Yes, absolutely. Free movement will end, but we still want to have a sensible approach to immigration, but we want to make sure that elected members accountable to their constituents in this House that has the last say on it.
And Bridget Phillipson.
Mr. Speaker, does the Secretary of State intend to set out any form of detailed regional economic impact assessments so that we can fully understand the scale of the damage to jobs, livelihoods and living standards in the North East on the basis of what his government is proposing?
We'll make sure there's appropriate analysis as the negotiations progress, as the various documents, whether it's in the legislation or the agreements, come through this House for proper scrutiny in the usual way.
Mr. Andrew Jones.
Right honourable friend to his place, and can he confirm that the UK will resume its seat at the WTO and be in a position to do trade deals right across the world?
I thank my honourable friend. He's absolutely right. We will resume our seat at the WTO, and with some of the pressures for protectionism that we've heard on all sides, it is going to be hugely important that this government and this country take up the UK's role as a global champion of free trade, because it's good for businesses, it's good for consumers, and of course it's good for the very poorest countries in the world that want to trade their way to genuine economic independence.
Wayne David.
Mr. Speaker, in paragraph 6 of the first chapter of the White Paper, it states, and I quote, "The UK recognises that the single market is built on a balance of rights and obligations, and that the UK cannot have all the benefits of membership of the single market without its obligations." My question is this: is the government prepared to discuss the possibility of making financial contributions for the privilege of having access to that European market?
Well, I have to say to the honourable gentleman, we've already set out what we're going to do in relation to the withdrawal agreement on the financial settlement to pay our accounts and make sure in relation to those parts of the EU projects, whether it's Eurojust or whatever it may be, we pay our way.
Your answer to the question.
Mr. William Ragg.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome my right honourable friend to his place and cannot help but feel a little sorry for him at this time. Is he sure that there isn't another document developed with and previewed by other governments being cooked up behind the scenes by Mr Robbins and our former friend, the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, which will then be wheeled out to further undermine the previously stated positions of Her Majesty's government?
Yes.
Daniel Zeichner.
Returning to page 78 about science and innovation in this document, there's talk about association and participation in research schemes in future. But when the Prime Minister spoke back in May, she talked about having influence in those schemes. Why is the ambition being so watered down?
It's not being watered down. I understand the point the honourable gentleman is making. It's not being watered down, but you can engage in all of those kind of activities, as we do with countries around the world, without being a member of the political club with all the fetters on your democratic prerogatives.
David Duguid.
Very much, Mr. Speaker, and can I join yourself and others in welcoming my right honourable friend to his post. I also welcome the continuing and ongoing confirmation, time and time again, from this government that we are indeed leaving the common fisheries policy. And I don't regard that as any longer being in question. But can my right honourable friend also confirm that no amount of guaranteed and continued access to British waters should be given away during withdrawal negotiations, and will only be and that sharing of fishing opportunities will only be agreed in ongoing annual negotiations after we take our place as an independent coastal state?
Well, I thank my honourable friend, and I can confirm that we will be leaving the common fisheries policy, and we will proceed as an independent coastal state with control over our waters for fisheries and other matters.
Paul Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On page 95, paragraph 55, it says, without a hint of irony, that the Government has already demonstrated during the passage of the EU withdrawal bill that it will actively engage with suggestions from both houses about oversight of secondary legislation, adapting scrutiny arrangements as appropriate, and recognising the quality and expertise in the existing scrutiny structures in the Commons and in the Lords. Now, in light of today's shambolic performance, would the Minister like to enlighten us as to what parliamentary scrutiny really means in his eyes?
Very good.
It means, as the honourable gentleman knows, what we're doing right now, and there'll be plenty more opportunities to scrutinise both the White Paper in this House, in the other place and through select committees.
Helen Whately.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I also welcome my right honourable friend to his place? I've noticed that he has had to field questions today about the government's future negotiating strategy, which it would clearly not be in the national interest to answer. Does my right honourable friend agree that even in these passionate debates, we must put our country, not our party or any personal ambitions, we must put our country first?
My honourable friend is absolutely spot on. I do understand the legitimate concerns people have, or the questions they have, about the overarching structure and framework of the strategy the UK takes. It is something that should be debated in this place and in the wider public, as we're doing with this 100-page white paper. At the same time, some of the questions or the interventions seem to be more about trying to make sure that the UK stutters when we should be proceeding at pace to negotiate a deal which is good for all sides of this House and every side of this country and all corners of this country.
Alex Sobel.
In page 62, section 53 of the White Paper, it says the UK will continue to closely cooperate with the EU law enforcement and criminal justice agencies, and in section 54, the UK respect the remit of the courts of justice of the EU. How does he reconcile that view with his own votes? In 2012, we voted against the EU data sharing for criminal justice purposes. In 2013, we voted in favour of the UK leaving all the EU police and criminal justice matters. And in 2014, voting against the UK rejoining the serious European Union schemes for closer political and judicial cooperation in criminal matters.
Can I thank the honourable gentleman for his detailed scrutiny of my past record? As I've argued all along, and indeed this white paper makes clear, you can want to maintain and strengthen even operational law enforcement cooperation with the UK and the EU, including through its bodies like Europol and Eurojust, without being subject to the supranational jurisdiction of the ECJ or all the decision-making fetters. And indeed, if you look at Europol, Eurojust, they have a large number of association agreements with non-EU countries. The US, I think, at Europol has more liaison officers posted there than the average EU country.
Philip Hollobone.
My right honourable friend confirm A, that he won't extend Article 50, B, that no deal is better than a bad deal, and C, if there is a no deal, we keep our 40 billion quid.
Well, it is certainly the case, in my view and the government's view, that no deal would be better than a bad deal. But what we're aiming for here is the very best deal. He asked about the money, and I took some time in my remarks to set out that we've made clear that there needs to be a link between the obligations we undertake with the withdrawal agreement and then what we expect in relation to the future partnership deal on trade and security and other areas of those cooperation. That needs to be looked at as a whole, and if one side, whichever it may be, doesn't fulfil its side of the bargain, it will have consequences for the whole deal, and yes, that would include the money.
Angela Eagle.
Mr. Speaker, the White Paper says very little about the service industry, and particularly financial services, except that we want to keep access to integrated European markets whilst not really sticking with the rules. Isn't this more having your cake and eating it? And is it not highly unlikely that the EU will never agree to this kind of an approach?
Hear, hear.
No, I would say to the honourable lady, actually, it's clear that the UK can't remain under the EU passporting regime. That's intrinsic to membership of the EU. So our objective, based on that, is to agree a new economic and regulatory partnership in financial services. The new partnership will set some binding bilateral commitments that provide certainty and stability of access to each other's markets to firms, while allowing the UK and the EU to maintain and exercise autonomy when it comes to regulatory decisions and rulemaking.
James Cartledge.
Can I welcome my right friend to his position and say, given how short he's been there, he is giving a performance of very high calibre. But on the subject of free movement, whilst I accept that many colleagues share this very noble position that we should not have a discriminatory system, does he accept there is a big implication for unskilled migration? Because if we allow it in future, we would have to allow it from anywhere, not just restricting it to the EU. And does he accept that in those circumstances, non-EU migration would inevitably rise?
Well, I think my honourable friend makes a powerful point, and that's why we take the approach we do. We want to make sure that when we've got enhanced preferential trade relationship with a country, visas can go into the mix. That's the global practice right around the world. But it's absolutely crucial, as a matter of sound policy, but also for retaining public trust in our immigration system, that we have control over the things people care about. The numbers of people coming here, ensuring people that come here are self-sufficient, and making sure that if people threaten this country or commit criminal offences, they can be removed.
Tracy Brabin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Having attended the very welcome brief around the previous agreement, and without much time to actually scrutinise the white paper, could the Minister clarify for myself and my constituents how the eye-wateringly complicated fudge around the facilitated customs arrangement can be anything but a disaster for manufacturing, and in particularly the bed manufacturers of Batley and Spen?
Well, I thank the honourable lady for her comments. I think the facilitated customs arrangement is an innovative new model. It's a business-friendly model that seeks to facilitate the greatest possible trade. Well, she's complaining about it, but I'm trying to explain it to her. She might just take a moment to listen to the explanation. To facilitate the greatest possible trade between the UK and the EU, and it will make sure, when it's put in place, that up to 96% of UK goods trade is likely to pay the correct or no tariff at the border. And the key difference between the FCA and the previous arrangements under the proposed customs partnership that had previously been on the table is that the tariff revenue will be levied up front rather than reimbursed after the event, which I think we agree on this side would be more cumbersome and less effective in minimising the risk to trade.
Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the publication of this white paper, but these are complex issues. What my constituents, and indeed I want, is reassurance that this document will indeed return control over our borders, over our money and over our laws. And will he join me in suggesting that that people do not listen to some of the more siren voices around? They look at the detail of this document, they see where it delivers on those pledges, and then make their decision.
My honourable friend is absolutely right. Ending free movement is one of the aspects which motivated people to vote to leave the EU, but there is a much broader issue around immigration policy. What we seek to do in this document is make sure we have the balanced approach, which means elected members like my honourable friend and ministers and members from across the House are responsible for striking the right balance to get the benefits of immigration, but also to manage the pressures.
Christian Matheson.
Speaker, the chaos that we've seen this morning is entirely consistent with a government that has dodged scrutiny in this House at every turn. And to suggest to my right honourable friend for Ilford North that he's shouting from the sidelines when he's actually speaking from the benches of this House only amplifies that position. Can I draw the Minister's attention to paragraph 76? The economic partnership providing reciprocal arrangements would provide businesses and services to move their talented people. What does talented mean, and does it include, for example, nurses and care workers?
Good question. It's absolutely key when people need to move high-skilled members of staff across borders, and regardless of what that sector would be, that we've got the ability to do it. So we will obviously go into this with negotiation with the EU, but of course it can include all sectors. What we want to make sure is that where there are skills gaps, they can be plugged.
James Heappey.
Very much, sir. In paragraph 138, the government rightly commits itself to a continuation of the single energy market between Northern Ireland and Ireland. Can I encourage the Secretary of State that rather than making a special case for Northern Ireland, instead of considering leaving the European-wide internal energy market, we actually make a special case for energy altogether, which is spectacularly boring and uncontentious, and we just remain within the internal energy market, which will allow us to be interconnected with Ireland, as well as our friends across the Channel and North Sea?
Well, my honourable friend is making an interesting point. We've set out our proposals in the white paper, but of course, if as the negotiations and the legislation proceeds, he would like to write to me with the detailed suggestions he's making, I'd be very happy to look at it carefully.
It's just a bit of a silly one.
Clive Efford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The white paper clearly envisages a role for the European Court of Justice in perpetuity, for instance, in relation to trade disputes. Has the Secretary of State had any indication from the EU that they're prepared to participate in the arbitration process that is in this white paper and second-guess decisions of the European Court of Justice?
Well, I would just say to the honourable gentleman, it's not right to say that the ECJ would have jurisdiction over trade disputes. That would be the role of the arbitral mechanism. International arbitration is a global mechanism used by countries right around the world, and I don't see any reason why within Europe or with the relations with the EU there would be an anomaly. The ECJ deals with the laws in place within the EU and the member states in the same way the UK Supreme Court deals with the laws of the land in this country. International arbitration is designed, it's flexible, it allows arbitrators from both countries to make sure you deal with those international disputes, and it's perfectly consistent with global trade practice.
Chris Phil.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many of my constituents are concerned that we can strike independent, new free trade deals after leaving. Can the new Secretary of State, who I welcome to his place, we'll miss him in MHCLG, can he confirm that we will be able to strike those new trade agreements? And isn't the Swiss example a good one? They do have these associations with the European Union on product standards, and yet they have managed to do very good free trade agreements recently, including with India and China.
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and I know he's very well versed in international trade practice. The key advantage in the approach that we're taking is that we have the ability to remove the external tariff, to reduce tariffs as a WTO member and sign bilateral free trade deals, which is crucially important in terms of our leverage. And in relation to services, we'll not be bound by the rules of the EU, which allows us to take advantage not just of the wider services sector, but in particular in relation to financial services and, of course, the digital sector, which is so important to the future jobs this country will rely on.
Alan Brown.
Yes. Mr. Speaker, it's taken this government 2 years to publish what is just a big set of wish list. Paragraph 63, the UK proposes a new economic arrangement with the EU in financial services. Paragraph 130, explore options for an air transport agreement. Paragraph 134, options for reciprocal access for road hauliers. Paragraph 140, options for future energy relationship. Paragraph 143, close association with Euratom. So 2 years to state the blinding obvious. So what superhuman negotiation skills does he have to close out these issues in the next 3 to 4 months?
Well, lots of these issues are complex, and of course we've been guided or restricted to some degree by the approach of the EU, which has been a sequential one. But lots of thought has gone into this, lots of consultation has gone in, and we do now need to move at pace to get cracking with the other side in good faith and with goodwill to get this deal done.
James Morris.
Warmly welcome the Secretary of State to his place. He will be aware that the West Midlands economy has had one of the strongest export performances of any region of the UK. And can he provide reassurance that within this white paper it does not preclude us doing trade agreements around the world in order to help West Midlands businesses and create jobs in the West Midlands, which is of great importance to my constituents?
Thank my honourable friend, and I'm confident that as we leave the EU with a good deal, the businesses in the West Midlands will go from strength to strength. I also think we need to acknowledge that if we're signing up to the Common Rule Book on goods to the extent that they are needed to reduce friction at the border between the UK and the EU, that will, at least to some degree, tie our hands. But the huge advantage we've got if we leave the EU and we leave the customs union is that we can remove and reduce tariffs. We will have control over the services side of things, so we can have control over the regulation, and that's a huge advantage. And I think if we take those opportunities, he's absolutely right, we will, for the West Midlands and the whole UK, be able to boost trade.
Jeremy Lefroy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. One of the major and understandable arguments during the referendum was that when we joined the European Union in 1973, people didn't really understand what it was going to lead to. Does my right honourable friend, who I really welcome to his post, therefore recognise the great importance of communicating what's proposed here and what eventually is put to Parliament to the general public, and particularly the young people who are going to have to live with this for the next 30, 40, whatever years, as well as to Parliament itself? Sometimes this debate can seem to be in very dry terms. It's absolutely vital that the communication is there and the discussion is there with the public as a whole.
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right, and I remembered how insightful he was when we served on the Brexit Select Committee together. It is true that this needs to avoid being a Westminster bubble conversation. I've already had meetings with business groups from the CBI to the Federation of Small Businesses to make sure that the diversity of the business community views are fed through and that I understand them properly. And he's absolutely right, we need to go out and sell the message that Brexit, yes, is about managing some of the risks that are involved in any change in your relationship, but also the huge opportunities for us to grasp, including for the young people of this country.
Nigel Huddleston.
Mr. Speaker, my constituents are realistic, sensible and practical lot, and they know, unlike some politicians, that they won't always get 100% of what they want in life, but they do expect their politicians to deliver. And before the referendum, the 58% of my constituents who voted Brexit told me very clearly that what they wanted was control of their borders, control of their laws, an end to freedom of movement, and to stop spending millions of pounds in Europe for reasons that, or billions of pounds that they couldn't really understand. In very simple terms, Secretary of State, will this deal deliver on what my constituents want?
Yes, it will. And of course, we need to proceed at pace with our negotiations, with our EU friends, to make that happen. At the same time, of course, as he will know, we need to make sure that we're ready for any eventuality from the negotiations. But we're not looking for, to rely on those contingency plannings. We're looking to get the very best deal in this white paper. We've achieved it.
Thank you. Order.